The approach was made at low level, reportedly no more than 200 feet above the valley floor in places. The mountain walls pressing in on both sides, channeling the aircraft through terrain that offered no margin for error and no altitude at which to recover from a mistake. In winter, the Eifel ranges hold fog in their valleys like water in a cup. The tunnel entrance materialized through that fog as a rectangular black gap in solid rock, perhaps 4 or 5 meters of open bore framed by the hillside, with the railway line running straight through it into darkness. The navigator had already done his timing calculation. The pilot held the aircraft steady and aimed at the entrance, not at a target somewhere above ground that a bomb could fall toward, but at a horizontal hole in a mountain that the bomb had to enter nearly flat. The weapon had to be released on a shallow trajectory so that it would skip along the approach surface and carry into the bore rather than plunging into the ground in front of the portal. It couldn't be too high. The arc would be wrong, and the bomb would strike the hillside face above the entrance rather than pass through it. It couldn't come in too low. It would hit the portal sill and detonate on the stone threshold. It had to be exactly right, held to a tolerance that left no room for corrections once the valley walls started closing and the mountain filled the windscreen. The aircraft climbed and turned immediately after release. A delayed action fuse was supposed to ensure the bomb detonated inside the mountain rather than in the open air behind the departing crew. There was an interval between release and detonation. The crew trusted that interval. They had to. On the morning of the 1st of January 1945, 32 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines lifted 16 Mosquitoes from bases in Huntingdonshire into the pre-dawn dark. These were aircraft of No. 8 Pathfinder Group, numbers 128, 571 and 692 squadrons, carrying 4,000-pound bombs with delayed action fuses toward 14 railway tunnels buried in the Eifel Mountains. The target corridor ran between Koblenz, Trier and the front near St. Vith, the exact rail passage through which German supply had been feeding the Ardennes offensive since the 16th of December. 17 aircraft were sent, 16 attacked. What the histories of New Year's Day 1945 almost never mention is the second danger. The bomb didn't always stay inside the mountain. The de Havilland Mosquito bomber carried no defensive armament. No rear gunner's turret, no ventral gun position, nothing. Geoffrey de Havilland's argument from 1938 onward was that an aerodynamically clean, twin-engine aircraft, fast enough to outrun German fighters, had no need of the weight that gun turrets would impose. Strip away the armament, strip away the extra crew positions to man it, and you were left with something that was smaller, faster, and could carry a bomb load over a distance that heavier types with half again the crew could barely match. Air Marshal Freeman accepted the case eventually, and the result entered RAF service in November 1941. Just 2 men, pilot and navigator, sitting side by side in a cockpit narrow enough that their shoulders nearly touched, sharing a view through a single canopy. No bombardier, no gunners, no one watching the rear approach. What this meant in practical terms varied by altitude and mission type. At height, 30,000 feet or more, where the Mosquito's pressurized variants could cruise faster than some Luftwaffe interceptors could climb to meet them, the lack of guns was a calculated gamble that usually paid. At 200 feet above a fog-filled Eifel valley, with light flak batteries positioned on the ridgelines above, and the aircraft committed to a fixed, straight approach that couldn't deviate without losing the release geometry, The absence of any defensive armament was simply a fact that the two men in the cockpit had accepted before they took off. The Mosquito B Mark 16 was specifically modified with a bulged bomb bay to carry a single 4,000-pound bomb internally. Photographs from No. 128 Squadron, one of the 3 squadrons committed to the Eifel attack, show ground crew loading this weapon in 1944, a large cylindrical casing with a message chalked on the nose. The casing is what defines the weapon's character. Approximately 8 millimeters of steel, thin enough that you could dent it with a hammer blow, enclosing around 3,000 pounds of high explosive that accounted for approximately 3/4 of the bomb's total weight. It was designed to generate maximum air blast overpressure above ground, to demolish roofs, blow out walls, expose building interiors to fire. It wasn't designed to survive impact with rock, ballast, or railway infrastructure at the speed of an aircraft's bomb release. The aircraft carrying it could reach speeds above 400 miles per hour in the right conditions. At low level, where thicker air increased drag and the terrain demanded constant attention, the operational speed band was closer to 265 to 325 miles per hour. Fast enough that a Focke-Wulf 190 on a pursuit course would take time to close, but not fast enough to render light flak irrelevant. At 200 feet, there was no time for the flak gunner either. A Mosquito passing through a defended valley at that altitude crossed a gun's engagement window in seconds. The gun either found it in that window or it didn't. No aircraft in Bomber Command asked more of a crew against the firepower available to defend them. 16 days earlier, on the 16th of December, Germany had sent 3 armies through the Ardennes for the second time in 4 years. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge in Allied terminology, achieved genuine tactical surprise against thinly held American lines in the forested hill country of Belgium and Luxembourg. The operation's timing was calculated around weather. Winter fog and low cloud would keep Allied air forces grounded during the critical opening days. The forecast held. German armoured columns moved through the Eifel and into Belgium largely unmolested through mid-December. The main Allied asset, tactical air, sitting idle on sodden airfields. The offensive's supply logic ran entirely on rail. German military logistics depended on railway transportation for approximately 75% of internal movement. Fuel, ammunition, artillery shells, replacement troops, spare parts, winter equipment. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 wasn't the mechanized force that had driven across France in 1940. It was a force that in places relied on more horses than comparable divisions of 1918, with horse-drawn transport handling the last-mile supply that motorized vehicles and fuel shortages could no longer manage. But horses couldn't move tank ammunition from the Rhine to the Ardennes in the volumes the offensive required, and they couldn't move it fast enough. Rail did that. Rail was the circulatory system through which an offensive of this scale had to be sustained. The route ran east from the Rhine bridges, through the passes of the Eifel, through the tunnels where the highland ridges forced the railway lines underground, and down into the staging areas near the Belgian frontier. German operational security for the offensive had built tunnel concealment into its planning from the beginning. Trains were ordered to shelter inside tunnel bores during daylight hours to avoid Allied air observation. The tunnels were simultaneously supply conduits and hiding places. They could conceal a fully loaded ammunition train from aerial observation for hours at a time, invisible under hundreds of meters of solid rock, while Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed every open marshalling yard in the region. When the weather broke around the 23rd of December, Allied aircraft struck hard at what was visible. Open column formations, bridges, road intersections, marshalling yards. Between the 23rd and the 28th, the pressure from the air was relentless. But the tunnels were a different problem, and the difference was fundamental. A bomb falling from altitude onto a road or open track is a vertical event. The weapon descends toward a horizontal surface. A railway tunnel entrance is a horizontal bore in a vertical rock face. You can't bomb it from altitude in any useful way. The weapon can only strike the hillside above it, or the tracks approaching it, or the ground in front of it. None of those outcomes blocks the bore. Open track craters can be repaired in hours with the right equipment. A tunnel entrance collapsed by an internal detonation, rockfall inside the bore, lining collapse sealing the passage, requires engineering work that takes days or weeks, and there is no detour for a train. The Eifel range concentrates its rail routes through a limited number of fixed passages through the high ground. Those fixed passages were the jugular of the German supply network, and through December 1944 they had been almost entirely untouched by Allied air action, because no straightforward method existed for attacking them. The technique applied on the 1st of January had a lineage stretching back 15 months. It began, as so much of British precision bombing innovation did in this period, with Barnes-Wallis. Wallis had spent the early years of the war developing weapons that could attack targets conventional bombs couldn't reach. The upkeep bouncing bomb that destroyed the Ruhr dams in May 1943 was the most famous product of that thinking. But the same office was simultaneously developing Highball, a smaller spinning cylinder intended for Mosquito delivery against enemy shipping. In October 1943, Highball came to a railway tunnel in the hills of Pembrokeshire, Wales, for trials at the main Clochog bore. On the 7th of October, Mosquitoes dropped prototype Highball weapons at the tunnel entrance. The bombs rolled the length of the bore. At least one exited from the far end or broke through a protective wall beyond it. The result was filmed. British war planners had already considered whether Highball might be directed against Alpine railway tunnels to cut German supply routes into Italy. The documentation exists for that discussion, even if no operational commitment ever followed. The physical result of the main Clochog trials was unambiguous. A spinning projectile entering a railway tunnel at speed can transit the entire bore and emerge from the far portal. Highball never reached that operational application, but 8 months after main Clochog, on the night of the 8th and 9th of June 1944, No. 617 Squadron applied a second proof of concept with entirely different physics. The target was the Saumur railway tunnel in the Loire Valley, a principal reinforcement route toward the Normandy beachhead, through which German armoured units might move northward in the days following the Allied landings. The weapon was the Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound deep penetration bomb also designed by Wallis, intended to plunge through earth and concrete before detonating well below the surface. The Tall Boy's logic was nothing like Highball's. It didn't enter through the mouth of the tunnel, it fell from high altitude. The Lancasters carrying it came in above 20,000 feet and bored through the roof of the hillside above the tunnel, generating a seismic shock through the surrounding rock that collapsed underground structures from the earth itself. Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire marked the target. One Tall Boy pierced the roof of the Saumur tunnel, approximately 60 feet below the surface. The lining collapsed, a landslide ensued, and the route was blocked. It was the first operational use of the Tall Boy bomb, and it worked almost precisely as designed. The contrast between what Tall Boy did and what the Cookie Skip attempted is the key to understanding the January 1945 raids. Tall Boy brought the mountain down from above. It was an earthquake weapon. Its violence propagated through the rock itself, and the mountain was the mechanism of destruction. The skip bomb attempted something different. It sent an explosive device through the mouth of the tunnel, relying on the confined space inside to focus the blast, rather than on ground shock. The tall boy penetrated deeply enough to become structurally part of the hill before it detonated. The cookie, entering through the portal on a flat trajectory, remained inside the bore rather than inside the rock, surrounded by the tube, not embedded in the mass. These are different categories of target destruction, and the difference matters enormously for what happens when things go wrong. The Pathfinder group had developed skip bombing into tunnel mouths as part of its expanding operational brief during the Allied advance across France in 1944. The Wikipedia operational history of the Mosquito force records this explicitly. The group developed techniques for destroying railway tunnels by skip bombing delayed fuse bombs into tunnel mouths. The Eifel sortie on the 1st of January formalized that technique against a specific high-priority target set during an active crisis. The attack geometry was demanding in ways that compounded at every stage. The Mosquito approached at low level, reportedly around 200 feet above the valley floor, lower in some accounts, through terrain that had no room for corrections. The valley walls on both sides rose above the aircraft. The tunnel entrance ahead was a fixed point in a fixed hillside, and the aircraft's course had to be aligned with the bore axis, not angled, not offset, but aimed directly into it, for the skip trajectory to carry the bomb through the portal rather than into the stone beside it. At combat speed, the aircraft covered ground fast enough that the pilot had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of final alignment time with the target visible. The navigator managed bomb release. The pilot held the aircraft on the approach, keeping it level and on axis despite turbulence, despite the instinct to pull up away from the ridgeline ahead, despite the flak that was already coming from the gun positions positioned on the slopes above. The Mosquito couldn't jink or maneuver on the final approach without losing the geometry that the release required. It had to fly straight at the mountain, and it had to hold that line until the moment of release. Consider the numbers in isolation. At around 300 miles per hour, roughly 440 feet per second, a cautious estimate for a low-level combat pass, a Mosquito covers approximately 4,400 feet in 10 seconds. In open air, the lethal overpressure radius of a 4,000-pound detonation extends perhaps 100 feet at its most severe, with meaningful structural damage extending to perhaps 400 feet. By those figures alone, a departing aircraft at attack speed would be well outside the dangerous zone if the delay fuse gave that full interval. The escape arithmetic appears generous on paper. It stops appearing generous the moment the detonation occurs inside a confined tunnel bore rather than in open ground. And it stops appearing generous entirely if the bomb didn't detonate where it was supposed to. Some crews on the 1st of January made more than one run at their targets. The available records note this explicitly. The approach geometry was demanding enough that a single pass sometimes produced an unsatisfactory release, and the navigator called for another attempt. Each additional run meant repeating the entire approach profile, descending back to low level, realigning with the valley, flying straight toward the entrance through the same flak that had already had one shot at them, and holding steady again at the moment of release. A 4,000-pound blast weapon detonating inside a railway tunnel bore does not simply collapse the mountain above it. This distinction matters, and it's the one that most casual treatments of tunnel bombing get wrong. The rock mass above a railway tunnel was placed there long before any bomb arrived. The tunnel was engineered to carry that weight in compression, the lining, the rock arch, the overburden, all transferring load through compression in the surrounding material. A tunnel's structural challenge is external load, pushing inward from above and the sides. An internal explosion imposes a different kind of load, outward pressure, sudden and extreme, pushing against the lining from inside rather than squeezing against it from without. Tunnel linings aren't designed for that reversal, but the surrounding rock mass itself is substantial, and a blast weapon detonating inside a bore does not have the deep penetrating seismic coupling that makes a tall boy effective. The mountain does not come down. What happens instead is that the extreme local overpressure generated by the detonation has to go somewhere, and, in a cylindrical bore, the path of least resistance isn't outward through several meters of rock. It's along the axis of the bore, toward the portals at each end. Modern blast engineering has characterized this behavior in detail. In open air, overpressure from a detonation expands spherically. Pressure drops sharply with distance because the energy distributes across an expanding sphere. Inside a tunnel bore, that spherical expansion is impossible. The pressure can only move along the bore axis, forward and backward simultaneously, toward the near portal and toward the far portal. It decays with distance far more slowly than it would in the open. There is no volume to expand into, only length to travel along. By the time it reaches the portal openings, it exits as a directional blast wave, moving outward through each portal mouth with force that open-air geometry can't predict and that open-air distance calculations don't account for. This behavior has been documented in contexts ranging from engineering studies to real incidents. A small explosive detonating inside a long, straight tunnel bore propagates its shock wave with unusual persistence, in both directions along the axis, exiting each portal as a directed wave. The confined geometry amplifies the effect at the exits relative to what the same charge would produce in open air at the same distance. Apply this to the Eifel attacks. If a bomb entered a tunnel bore and detonated near the entrance, the ideal outcome, the result that would best collapse the portal approach, the near-portal blast wave was a hazard lasting only the few seconds of the pull-away climb. The aircraft was already climbing and turning, putting distance between itself and the entrance. But if the bomb carried further into the bore than intended, because its skip velocity on entry was higher than expected, or because it bounced off the lining and maintained speed, or because its thin casing deformed rather than detonating cleanly on first impact, the detonation could occur much closer to the far portal. The channeled blast wave would then exit primarily through the far end, driven outward from the opposite side of the hill at considerable energy. An aircraft flying beyond that hillside, in the valley that opened on the other side of the tunnel, would be in the direct path of that wave, emerging from the rock without warning. And if the bomb transited the bore entirely before its fuse fired, the exit was the far portal itself. And the bomb was now a live, armed, 4,000-pound device emerging from the far side of a mountain in the direction any aircraft in that valley might be traveling. This isn't a theoretical construction, assembled from first principles after the fact. The main Clochog tunnel trials in October 1943 demonstrated that a spinning projectile, delivered into a railway tunnel bore at speed, could transit the full length of that bore and emerge from the far end. The highball bombs rolled the length of the Welsh tunnel. At least one broke through a protective wall at the far portal. The footage existed. The result was documented. The people planning Mosquito tunnel attacks in 1944 and 1945 operated within a body of institutional knowledge that included that outcome. Post-war accounts associated with Wing Commander Thomas Welch Horton, a New Zealander who flew 4,000-pound bomb operations with No. 105 Squadron throughout 1943 and 1944, was decorated with the DSO and the DFC and BAR, gave a long-form oral history interview to the Cambridge Air Force One's podcast in 2012, and died in Florida in December 2021 at the age of 101. Describe the far-end problem in direct terms. In secondary accounts drawing on Pathfinder crew testimony and associated records, at least one account describes a released bomb apparently travelling the length of a tunnel bore and producing smoke and debris from the far portal, a pattern consistent with either a bomb exiting the bore entirely or with blast venting through the far end after an internal detonation. That attribution hasn't been confirmed against the catalogued audio record of Horton's 2012 interview. The distinction between a bomb physically transiting the bore and blast venting through the far portal after an internal detonation isn't resolvable from the available secondary record. Both outcomes are physically plausible. The main CLOCOG trials established transit as a real result. Blast venting through portals is documented engineering reality. The anecdote, however precisely it can be attributed, describes a real failure mode in the skip bombing technique, one that the geometry of the attack made possible, regardless of whether any specific crew ever observed it at the moment it occurred. The pilot pulling away from the near portal after releasing his bomb couldn't see the far portal. He didn't know whether the weapon had detonated where the plan assumed, whether it had rolled further than intended, or whether blast was propagating outward from the other side of the hill. He couldn't see any aircraft that might be flying in that zone. He couldn't signal them, couldn't warn them, couldn't do anything about it at all. The weapon was beyond his knowledge and beyond his control from the moment it left the aircraft. And what it might do inside the mountain, and to whom, was entirely outside the reach of either man in the cockpit. While 16 Mosquitoes were threading through those mountain valleys on delayed action fuses, a very different operation was unfolding 100 miles to the northwest. Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's massed assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, put approximately 900 Luftwaffe aircraft into the air against 17 Allied bases on the same morning. Bf-109s and FW-190s from more than a dozen Jagdgeschwader swept low across the winter fields of Belgium, targeting the runways, hangars and parked aircraft of the Allied tactical air forces. At Eindhoven, at Melsbroek, at Asch and Volkel and Giltse Reihen, German aircraft arrived at treetop height and began shooting up everything on the ground. The attacks reached their targets through the mid-morning and destroyed or damaged hundreds of Allied aircraft in the space of a single sortie. The Luftwaffe committed everything it had husbanded through the autumn. The planning for Bodenplatte had actually preceded the Ardennes ground offensive. It had been intended to strike on the 16th of December and had been delayed repeatedly by weather until New Year's morning, the first day that happened to be suitable. The strategic arithmetic that followed was catastrophic for Germany. Over 270 German fighters were destroyed. Allied ground losses were significant but replaceable within days. German pilot losses were permanent. The Allies rebuilt. The Luftwaffe fighter force in the west was permanently crippled. Bodenplatte was the last large-scale offensive operation the Luftwaffe mounted in the theatre, and the scale of what it cost ensured that nothing comparable would follow. It's also the only operation of that morning that most general histories record at any length. Bodenplatte left wrecked aircraft on Allied airfields that could be photographed, counted and reported by both sides. The Mosquito crews in the Eifel left crew report entries and 2 aircraft accident records. The historical weight shifted entirely toward the larger, more visible, more photographed action, and the tunnel raids disappeared into the background of a day that everyone knew as the day of the German airfield attack. One aircraft, Mosquito serial PF-414, didn't return. Aviation Safety Network records confirm that it took off at 06:51 for the tunnel mission, was hit by flak, and flew into a hillside southeast of Schuld towards Ardenau in the Eifel. Both crew members were killed. The names that circulate in secondary accounts of this loss appear to be phonetic approximations from a transcribed spoken source rather than confirmed archival spellings, and they can't be treated as established records without direct consultation of Commonwealth War Graves Commission files. The CWGC search requires the confirmed aircraft serial. PF-414, the 27th of January takeoff time, the Schuld area crash site, and should be conducted before any attempt to name these men in a broadcast context. What the available records do confirm is the cause, flak, and the location, a hillside in the Eifel at the start of 1945, during an operation that was overshadowed so completely by Bodenplatte that it has almost vanished from the broader historical record of that morning. The light flak concentrated in the narrow Eifel valleys was exactly the threat that made low-level operations so expensive. A twin-engine aircraft threading through mountain terrain at rooftop height presents a brief but predictable target to every gun on the ridgelines above it. The aircraft can't vary its altitude without losing the approach geometry. It can't jink without losing the alignment. The gun crew on the hillside does not need to be accurate across a wide envelope. It needs to catch the aircraft in the few seconds it spends on the committed approach leg, when the pilot can't take evasive action. When both engines took hits, there was no altitude at which to recover and no speed at which the loss of 2 Merlins could be managed. The hill southeast of Schuld was where the trajectory ended. A second Mosquito, PF-411, was lost the same morning in a non-combat accident at the departure airfield, almost certainly RAF Whiten, No. 8 Group's primary Mosquito base in Huntingdonshire. 14 aircraft and 28 men brought themselves back. The 2 that didn't came in different ways, one to flak in a valley, one to a mechanical failure before the valley was even reached. 14 surviving aircraft reported what they had observed. 11 crews assessed that their bombs had detonated at or immediately adjacent to their tunnel entrances.
These are crew assessments made at attack speed from a climbing, banking aircraft in winter fog and smoke. The best available evidence of what occurred inside those tunnel bores, and necessarily limited by the circumstances in which they were made. They aren't post-strike reconnaissance reports. No photographic confirmation of portal collapse from this raid has been identified in the available sources. No German operational record tying a specific detonation to a specific supply disruption on the 1st of January has been found. The granularity required to make that connection simply does not exist in the surviving archive. What does exist across the logistics literature of the Ardennes campaign is documentation that Allied air interdiction of Eifel rail approaches contributed to the overall failure of German supply to sustain the offensive through January. The offensive ran out of momentum not because of any single bombing mission, but because of accumulated pressure across every point in the supply chain. Bridges, marshalling yards, open track, fuel stocks, rail schedules. The bulge failed because the fuel and ammunition that German armoured units needed to keep moving
stopped arriving in the quantities and on the timelines the plan required. Whether 14 aircraft on New Year's morning contributed meaningfully to that pressure is a question the records can't definitively answer. The honest position is that they may have, and that the rail tunnels they targeted were real choke points on routes that mattered. The method wasn't repeated at scale in the weeks that followed, and this is sometimes read as evidence that the technique failed badly enough to be abandoned. The logic is simpler and more practical. By early February 1945, Allied forces were preparing to advance through the Eifel, using the same railway network they had spent January trying to block. Wrecking tunnels that British and American supply trains would need within weeks was poor planning under any calculation. The raid was timed to a specific crisis. Once the German offensive collapsed, the operational logic that had justified destroying those tunnels changed with it. The method wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was set aside because the situation that made it rational had passed. The forgotten quality of the New Year's Day raid isn't only that it happened while Bodenplatte drew all the historical light. It's what the technique itself asked of the men who flew it, and what the physics of the method made possible, whether those men could observe it or not. Skip bombing a delayed fuse weapon into a railway tunnel requires the crew to fly at low level through defended terrain toward a fixed entrance in a mountain, release a large explosive device on a flat trajectory, and then fly away while the device travels inside the mountain on a timer they can't see. From the moment the bomb left the aircraft, neither man in the cockpit had any further influence over what it did. Its velocity on entry, its path inside the bore, where it came to rest or continued to roll, where it detonated, and the direction and magnitude of the blast waves it generated, all of this was determined by physics that set itself in motion at the release point and continued without any available intervention. The near-portal blast was the risk the crew knew they were running. Pull away fast enough, put enough distance between the aircraft and the entrance in the available time, and the open-air blast radius of the weapon's detonation wouldn't reach them. At 300 miles per hour, 10 seconds of flight covers over 4,000 feet. Comfortably beyond any lethality radius that open-air geometry would predict for a 4,000-pound explosion. This is the calculation that made the attack viable at all. Without the delayed fuse and the time it bought, no aircraft could have survived the blast at release altitude and release range. But the near-portal blast was only one of the possibilities. The far-portal blast was the one they couldn't calculate, because it required knowing where, inside the bore, the bomb detonated. And they couldn't know that from a departing aircraft already past the ridgeline. The bore-directed blast wave exiting the far portal would propagate outward from the other side of the hill, aimed into whatever valley opened on that side of the mountain. An aircraft flying in that zone, approaching a different tunnel target, returning from an earlier pass, transiting the area on any heading, would have no warning and no ability to respond. The blast would emerge from the rock suddenly and silently, and whatever it struck without announcement. The highball at Mein Klokhog in October 1943 demonstrated that a projectile could transit a real railway tunnel bore entirely. If the delay fuse allowed enough time, and if the bomb maintained enough velocity inside the bore, the same outcome was physically available to a cookie bomb entering the Eifel tunnel system at attack speed. The cases aren't identical. Highball was a spinning cylinder specifically designed to roll, while the cookie's thin casing and non-aerodynamic shape would subject it to different forces inside the bore. But the possibility of transit wasn't theoretical. It had been filmed, documented, and filed within the same institutional system that planned the January 1945 attacks. Wing Commander Horton's account, attributed in secondary sources to his post-war recollections and the oral history he gave in 2012, describes this risk from the perspective of a crew who experienced something consistent with it: a bomb producing evidence of far-end exit or far portal blast during a tunnel attack. The account can't be verified against the archived primary recording at the present state of available research. But the phenomenon it describes is real. The precedent for it existed in the highball trials, and the physics of blast channeling in a confined bore make far portal venting an outcome that follows inevitably from the geometry of the attack, not an anomaly requiring special explanation. The technique stands at the junction of three stages in a lineage that runs from October 1943 to June 1944 to January 1945. Barnes-Wallace's highball established that a spinning projectile could be delivered into a tunnel bore and emerge from the far end. Physical transit demonstrated in a real tunnel, filmed and documented. The Tallboy at Saumur in June 1944 established that a tunnel could be blocked by penetrating the mountain above it and causing ground shock collapse. A fundamentally different mechanism, bringing the overburden down rather than sending blast along the bore. The Cookie Skip in January 1945 occupied an uncertain position between those two precedents. It was a blast weapon, not an earthquake weapon, so it couldn't replicate Tallboy's deep seismic coupling. It wasn't a spinning cylinder designed to roll, so it couldn't reliably replicate highball's controlled transit. What it could do was enter the bore on a flat trajectory and detonate inside it, focusing the blast along the bore axis toward both portals, with outcomes at each end that were real but not fully predictable from the point of release. This is the physics the men of number 128, 571 and 692 squadrons flew into on New Year's morning. 32 Merlin engines over those snow-covered valleys, while the Luftwaffe's last major throw was burning itself out over Allied airfields to the northwest. No guns on the Mosquitoes, no formation umbrella providing mutual support. No second aircraft watching the rear. 2 men in a wooden airframe, the same birch ply and balsa construction that kept the aircraft's weight low enough to carry a 4,000-pound weapon and still fly faster than most of what the Luftwaffe could put in the air. Approaching tunnel entrances at low level through the fog and flak of the Eifel winter. Releasing a weapon they could no longer control. Climbing away to put the necessary distance between themselves and whatever the delayed fuse would eventually trigger, inside the mountain or at the far end of it, or both simultaneously. History can't tell us whether a specific bomb sealed a specific tunnel bore long enough to halt a specific ammunition train on the 1st of January 1945. It can tell us that PF-414's crew were still flying toward their target when the flak found both engines, and that the hillside southeast of Schuld was where their aircraft came down. It can tell us that 11 of the 14 surviving crews assessed their bombs as having reached or entered their targets, reporting on the basis of what they could see through winter fog while climbing away at combat speed, which is the best available measure of what occurred, and also a measure that leaves a great deal unresolved. It can tell us that some of those 14 crews made more than one pass at their targets, returning through the flak because the first approach hadn't produced a satisfactory release, which tells you something precise and unremarkable about how much they cared about getting it right. and something harder to state precisely about the nature of what that decision required of them. The same skip geometry that made a tunnel choke point attackable also made the bomb an uncontrolled variable once it was inside the bore. A weapon that failed to seal the bore could exit the far end toward any aircraft in the valley beyond, or could vent its blast uselessly through portals built into a structure designed to hold a mountain's weight in compression. Against that double uncertainty, the flak in the approach valley and the bomb's unknown behavior behind the mountain, unarmed Mosquito crews flew the Eifel on New Year's Day, while Bodenplatte lit the wider front, betting skill and speed and a fuse interval against rock and ridge and their own weapon. The forgotten part isn't only that the raid may have pressed on the supply lines feeding an offensive the Allies were already breaking from the ground up. It's that the technique asked pilots to outrun a weapon that might come back out of the earth behind them, and that the physics making this possible had been demonstrated, filmed, and filed 15 months before they flew. Subscribe for more stories like this.